Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the UND GradTalk podcast. I'm your host, Lincoln Retzloff. The UND GradTalk podcast interviews former UND grad students, some current, and just seeing what people are getting up to in their lives right now. Today, we have a very special guest, David Muhonen, currently a principal, pre-K through 12 in Pembina, North Dakota. For the last 11 years prior, was working as an English and social studies teacher in Grafton. David, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate the time.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me in. This will be fun.
All right, so kind of just ask you about what have you been getting up to lately? How's life been? Anything going on?
Nothing major going on. I think the change over to being a principal from being a teacher is one I'm trying to kind of get used to still. My previous school was much bigger than the school I'm working in now, so I think trying to get used to the kind of the speed and almost the slowdown was something that I think was difficult at first. But no, I mean, I love what I'm doing now. I said to my wife not that long ago, I don't know if I've had this much fun in education in almost 12 years. So other than the commute, I got 40 miles each way every day. So other than that, it's going pretty darn good. It's a great place to be.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get into more of that in a bit, but kind of just talk about your background. Where are you from? Where'd you go to high school?
Well, I'm Red River Valley, born and raised. I'm originally from Hillsborough, North Dakota, but I graduated from Fargo North. Went to NDSU, where I got my undergrads in classical languages, history, and then I went back and did social studies education. And then just this past summer, actually, I graduated from UND with my master's in teaching and leadership.
Okay. What kind of got you into education? Like, why did you choose that realm in particular?
It's a great question, too. Forever in my life, I wanted to be a doctor. That was a medical doctor. That was my thing. I started at NDSU my first 2 years there. I was pre-med. And then I switched over really to history and classical languages because that was an interest of mine. I worked at a bank while I was in college for almost 8 years. And towards the tail end of that, my wife, who was in education, kind of threw out the idea that I should just go back and get my teacher's credentials so I could go be a teacher if I wanted to. And, I always tell everybody, I got into teaching for, the wrong reasons. I didn't like kids. I didn't want to work with kids. If I did teach, it had to be upper level and anybody who wanted to be there. And my first job was as a middle school teacher, which was the last thing that I wanted. Yeah. And so, I found out that I did like kids. I liked working with kids. Middle school, actually, it's not for everybody, but it was for me. And, from there, it was just kind of growing in the profession. But, everybody gets into teaching for different reasons. And I think maybe that's why I like teaching so much, is I found other reasons kind of when I got into it.
Did you have any, maybe teachers, professors, or just mentors in general growing up that had a really big impact on your life? They don't necessarily have to be teachers or anything, but they kind of made you kind of the person you are now and maybe shaped the way you are as a principal at the moment.
Absolutely. In fact, there are two. There's my dad. I mean, my dad, has always been my rock. My dad, he'll say one of his most favorite things was he and I graduated from college the same year. He's worked for American Crystal Sugar for now almost 51 years. Wow. He's retiring next month. But, his kind of commitment to his work and his commitment to his company, I think, was something that really, I was instilled in me. I think every interview I've ever been, I've always approached a job as in this is going to be the job I work at the rest of my life, because that's the kind of commitment that I'm willing to make. But from an educational standpoint, and really, I think, too, just from a human being standpoint, I had a Latin teacher at Fargo North. His name was David Volk. One time, maybe two-time North Dakota Teacher of the Year. And, he was what I would say the only teacher who really challenged me when I was in high school. School's always come really easy for me. Learning a language didn't, it doesn't for most people right away. And, I think like a lot of people, I was just more than willing to give up than actually try. And, he was a real mentor to me because, one of the most humble people I've ever met in my entire life, even though he might have been the greatest teacher ever. I mean, nationally recognized. He was just so special to anybody that's ever been, in one of his classes. So, he's always somebody that I kind of call back on to as an educator in terms of how I deal with my day, how I deal with content, how I deal with kids, because, he too, like me, started kind of on a different path in school. He wanted to be a priest. Mm-hmm. And he was taking Latin classes at NDSU under actually the same professor that I had when I was there, Dr. Andrini, and she was a dream too. But, he ended up not going into the priesthood, becoming an English teacher, and then a Latin teacher too, and really excelled at it. And I think that was something I thought about in my undergrad, where, the medical doctor thing just was not something I was super interested in pursuing. Not that it was too difficult or anything, but it just wasn't what I realized as an adult I wanted. And that brought a lot of confusion. As a college kid, you're halfway done. Do you just suck it up and do it? Or do you make kind of that major life change? And I talked to him about it too. Like, what does that look like? And I think I can't ever think, and I've tried. It's kind of like talking to a parent. Like, you can't ever thank those kinds of people enough. Mm-hmm. And you can tell them all you want about how much they mean to you, how much they've changed your life for the better, how much you want to be just like them. And it's never really how you feel. Mm-hmm. And so, hats off to those two guys, because I certainly wouldn't be on the path I'm on without those two.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, having great mentors in your life, they can really, shape, the direction that you're going and kind of be the person you want to be. So, kind of transitioning a little bit here. You went to NDSU and then years later went into the Masters of Science Teaching and Leadership Principalship, the graduate program here at UND. Why did you choose that program in particular and UND?
Well, that's, a good question too, because I'd tell you that 15 years ago, for sure, always had respect for UND. Mm-hmm. I think it's, a flagship school in the state, but I grew up in an NDSU only household. And so the idea, even in my undergrad, I had applied to UND, got in, and I had scholarships, but that was just never, felt like never an option emotionally for me, quite honestly. But, when you're young and you don't really understand the world and you only think of things in terms of sports and colors, so to speak, like that was where I was at the time. But, when I moved up to Grafton, obviously UND's proximity helps a lot, but a lot of people that I really valued in terms of their knowledge and their understanding of graduate work spoke very highly of UND. Dr. Olson in particular, and she was kind of the one who, I don't want to say steered me to UND, but really kind of made that seem like an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And she received her master's and doctorate from UND, and she kind of works as kind of an adjunct faculty for them, especially in rural areas. But the other things that I think that helped too, the timing was perfect. My wife and I had just had our second son, Simon. I was coaching football and golf, and I was kind of looking to kind of wind some of that down. And, I think that opened the door for that time to do graduate school. And so as far as UND is concerned, through the Burgum Foundation Rural Scholarship, I was looking at coming to UND, and then Dr. Link kind of turned me and a couple of colleagues onto an aspiring principals grant, which is what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I signed up to go back to be a principal. So all those things kind of fell into place, and it was probably the best decision I've ever made.
Awesome. Yeah. What was kind of your experience with the MSTL program here at UND? Do you have any, specific, you did it very quickly, it looks like. So, kind of talk about just your general experience with that overall.
Well, like I said before, I've always loved school. School's mm-hmm. always kind of come easy for me. Not that I don't have to work, of course you do, but it was when we started the summer of 2024, let's say the May of 2024, and it was right at the end of the school year in terms of us teaching, all of us that were in the program. I still had a couple of weeks of golf season and state golf. And so like it didn't feel like it might have been the best time to start. It was kind of, and you know, I don't want to say we were rushed. We weren't rushed, but it just felt like this huge crunch. And the first semester in the summer, especially Dr. Link's class, which was one of the first ones that we had, was condensed. I mean, we were doing really good work like every day, you know, and I mean, there were a couple of times I was jumping into Zoom meetings or meetings with Dr. Link or with our cohort while I was in the clubhouse at Carrington, which is where we had state golf that year. Like it was hard to kind of ease into it, I guess is what I'm trying to say, you know, and I think that just kind of was the fact that I had been out of school for over a decade, you know, almost forgot what it was like to be a college student again. And so kind of all those anxieties and worries and deadlines that you've never had to deal with for a long time, all of a sudden come back and you're like, now I have a job and I have a family and everything else you have to work around. But as maybe kind of terrible or bad as that sounds, like it was such a great program. And I think also having Dr. Link to start, who was kind of the head of this cohort, was you could ask her any question at any time. She was right there to help you out. She was such a resource, and everybody in the educational department was as well, like not to discount them. But once, and I hate to say we, because I'm speaking for a couple of people that I was working with that did it too. I think once we made it through that first semester, it was like, oh, wow, like we can do this. This is great. We're learning an incredible amount. I learned more in those, what would that be, 4 semesters of graduate work than I feel like I learned in my 6.5 years doing undergrad work at NDSU. And everything that came out of there was applicable to my now current job. Like I way more prepared to be a principal than I ever was when I first walked into a classroom as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, kind of piggyback off what you just said there, what were some of the things in the program, or how specifically did it prepare you for the job you have now as a principal?
Well, you know, I think you have to look at it, you know, and I think my own thoughts of what a principal was or an administrator was so skewed. You know, think of it like a sports team and like the front office and then the back office. Like as an educator, you get to see some of the front office with discipline, you know, time management, scheduling, that kind of thing. But, you know, once you actually are in that position, you see what it takes to make all of that work. You know, I mean, as a teacher in the classroom, your knowledge of what goes on in that office is surface level. And so I think it was kind of hard sometimes at first, especially looking at a lot of like curriculum classes we took. And I thought to myself, like, well, I'm kind of familiar with this already with 10 plus years in the classroom. You know, as a principal, I can't think of, you know, where all of this would apply. Like, I want to know how I don't get sued. I want to know how I deal with weapons in the school or something like that. And there were classes that taught you that too. But the program at UND was so well-rounded that, you know, we were doing scholarly work while also looking at practical problems that we might encounter as well. And so, you know, it was so comprehensive that, you know, and the fact that everybody was so approachable, Dr. Link, Dr. Schleicher, Dr. Schlenker, like all these faculty that, you know, I think my knowledge or my thought about, you know, college as an undergrad, where that's kind of the big bad professor. And, you know, it just doesn't feel, and obviously as you get further into a program, people feel like they become more approachable. But I mean, from day one to the final day, if I had questions, concerns when I got this job last February, I didn't start it obviously till the school year, but I mean, now all of a sudden it was crunch time. I had 3 months to kind of figure my stuff out before I actually had to start doing work. And so there were great people that we could reach out to. There were great resources. There were people who had been through the MSTL program in years past that, you know, Dr. Link or or anybody could get you in contact with. And, I think even the follow-up to, I still stay in contact with members, in the UND educational department when I got questions, if I'm looking for resources. In fact, I emailed a week or two ago about, let me know when you have some graduates because I might have some jobs. And those connections you can make both professionally, but also almost emotionally. I mean, you just can't say enough about it.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. What would you say, or how did teaching, both middle school and high school kind of prepare you for, I guess, the position you're in right now?
It prepared me a lot, and I think when you're teaching middle school kids, when you're teaching high school kids, there's a certain value in trying to stay young and hip and fresh. I'm not old by any means, certainly not in the profession. I'm 38. But, things change. And I could think of a million different ways. I'm trying to think about the ones that might be most appropriate, but trying to stay hip on current lingo, on slang, on things like that, so you can make connections with kids. It really kind of reprograms your mindset on how you deal with young adults and adolescents. And I think middle school and high school is, I think, easier because you actually get to form deeper connections. I think sometimes in the elementary school, and I've noticed this now as a principal, those interactions again are kind of superficial because the needs of many elementary school kids are very basic.
Sure.
I want this, I don't want this. But being able to kind of help foster these young adults into becoming real adults and kind of showing them what a stable relationship is, what hard work and ethics and morality, I think, I think that just has really allowed me to be able to kind of have conversations that are both meaningful, but also not commanding either. I think that was a hard thing as a boss, first off, talking to adults again. I spent the last 11 years basically dealing with kids. And so now trying to form those adult relationships, I'm sure I come off as such a goon or at least I did initially with my new staff. But I do think that ability to just kind of make these connections that are open and that people can trust you and they trust that you're going to be honest with them, because the worst thing you can do in education is lie to a kid, because once you're a liar, they'll never forget it or let it go. And so, I think it's really helped kind of shape me in terms of how I have to act too. And, I'm not going to say I was buck wild, but my entire personality has shifted since I've been in education, because there's so many more things you have to think about constantly, especially in a small town. Everybody sees everything, everybody hears everything. And so if you're not genuine all the time, you lose a lot of that credibility. And so I think working with this group of kids has really kind of allowed me to become who I really probably was deep inside, but at the very least, become more of a responsible person, because you have to be responsible to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to kind of lead off that a little bit, how different has kind of the change been between Grafton and now Pembina?
Night and day.
Yeah.
It really is. And, and I think what was nice about Grafton when I was there, and I still love that place, I still live there, my kids go to school there, is that school very similar to what it was like for me growing up in Fargo North. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very diverse population, very diverse, economically. You get kids from all walks of life, and I think, just the sheer number of kids, you'll have classes of 21, 22, which was relatively typical for me, at least in the high school at Fargo North. I think there, because you have more kids there, you can have more discipline issues. But now going to Pembina school, I had more kids on my caseload last year than I do in the entire building in Pembina. That was kind of hard. Like, I mean, I think that was really hard for me to get used to right away. I was so used to boom, boom, boom. You know, this kid was disrespectful. This kid got into a fight. This kid, you know, isn't going to have food to eat over the weekend. Like, those were major concerns that you had as an educator in Grafton. And in Pembina, I'm not saying that those don't exist, but they're certainly not out in front of your face all the time. Pembina is a very, very close-knit community. And so I think, you know, there's so many more, it feels like tangible resources there if you need it. But, you know, I will say, you know, a huge similarity for a guy like me. Again, I'm originally from Hillsborough, which, you know, isn't huge by any means, but having lived and grew up in Fargo and graduated from Fargo North, you know, you're the big city, like you're Class A. And so, you know, endearing yourself to the community in Grafton, very similar to me working on trying to endear myself in Pembina too, especially because I'm not living there right now. You know, I commute every day. But I mean, it has been a wonderful change. And I'll say this about both places. And I'm not trying to say fluff, like it's true. I mean, I think I have a great staff at Pembina. They're all like hyper committed to their kids and their class. Like, and at, you know, the first couple of weeks, it was almost like nails on the chalkboard for me. Like, how do you care so much? Like, I mean, not saying that people don't, but everybody that I worked in Grafton, administration, teachers, paras, any other support staff, like they're the same way, you know, and I think that has made that transition really easy for me.
What would you say has been, on the opposite side, the most challenging part of your transition so far?
I do think, you know, just being kind of a neophyte in the position, you know, I think trying to make sure you're doing the right thing. You know, I think sometimes it's easy as the principal or the person in charge to just, you know, kind of dictate from the tower, so to speak. And so, I mean, I've made a mistake or two like that, you know, let's unilaterally try to not do this anymore. And then all of a sudden one parent's like, yep, sorry, like the school handbook says this. And you know, and I made the comment to my assistant principal when we didn't make that change. I said, you know, it's not the first time I've had my hands slapped. It's not going to be the last. Like, you know, I think there's a certain set way that most people like things done. And Pembina has done a great job academically, emotionally, in terms of behavior and things like that. So when you step into a job like that, you're really just trying to kind of stay out of the way. You know, you want to affect the changes that you want to make, but you have to be patient and you have to get that buy-in. And so I think for me, the biggest issue is kind of that patience. You know, just, I'm normally a patient guy too, but like, you know, you want to kind of, you want to affect your change. You want to put your stamp on things. And I think sometimes less is more. And so I'm kind of learning that and getting kind of schooled by, you know, people in the community as well as, you know, staff in terms of this is what's worked here in the past. Like, how can we work to kind of keep this thing?
Yeah, I mean, how would you say, from the principal's perspective right now, do you go about making sure every single student is being seen or supported from, you know, pre-K all the way through 12?
That's a good question. And, you know, and again, I think in a place like Pembina, that's easier. You know, you're talking about 138 kids roughly, maybe give or take one or two. And so it's very easy to be visible. It's very easy to make connections with kids. You know, it's very easy to learn that amount of names. But I mean, I think the trappings of any school, whether big or small, are still there. You know, I still think it's easy for kids to kind of socially and emotionally fall through the cracks. I think, you know, it's in a small town, sometimes it's harder to maintain friendships because the pool is so small, you know, and I think that was even something in Grafton I struggled with at first. I don't understand how 70 kids in a grade can't all be friends with one another. Now, you know, I have a class of 6. You know, how can you not be best friends? It's just 6 of you. Like, and it's always been 6 of you. And so, you know, I think trying to do what you can to not be a stranger is something that I've really kind of put as as a focus in the forefront in terms of, I'm brand new, you don't know me. Everything that I know about school and student behavior is, for the most part, different than what's going on here. So, I'm going to need a little bit of grace to get, to your level. And at the same time, I'm going to need you to kind of come in through that open door too. But, it's still a work in progress.
What would you say are probably the big differences? I mean, you went to school in Fargo, then Grafton, now Pembina, between a bigger school and then, say, I guess a smaller one like you're at right now.
Well, I'll say, I had a conversation actually with a student about this the other day. I think the one nice thing about a place like Fargo or Bismarck or Grand Forks is because of the sheer number of students, I think it's a lot easier for somebody to find at least one other person like them. And I'll use the word like friends. I think it's a lot harder in a small place sometimes if you're different or you have different interests than your peers. I think it's a lot harder for those kind of friendships to form, especially when you're not mobile. Once you get a driver's license, whatever, and I think kind of dating is the same way in a small town like that too. But I also think resources. I mean, you have to be in a smaller district. You have to be smarter about your resources. I think you feel like sometimes, especially in this climate in terms of educational funding, like you have to be solid on your research if you're going to spend money, kind of thing. You can't just, wasn't like a couple of years ago when there's grant money and federal money all over the place where you could just, there's blank checks everywhere.
Yep.
Like now you've got to be a lot more prudent. You have to try to make what you have work sometimes. You have to prioritize what you need to do. And I think that's another thing that maybe, I hate to speak from an educational standpoint in a place like Fargo, but I think that's one thing that you might not have to concern yourself with as much. And I think in Pembina, and as well as Grafton, in this climate too, you just have to be able to stretch your resources a little bit thinner than maybe we have in the past, while also providing the same level of education or better education than you had in the past. So it puts a lot of stress on administrators. It puts a lot of stress on teachers to try to make sure that those kids don't feel like anything has changed. If anything, it's got to the better. No different than, a family stretching out a meal.
Sure.
And so I fortunately don't have to deal so much with the financial side. I'll leave that up to the superintendent, and he does a fantastic job. But still some things you got to kind of concern yourself with. And that's definitely what I would say one of the biggest differences between the two.
Yeah, kind of building off the climate, all those kind of things. Where do you see education itself heading in the next decade, and how should small schools in particular adapt to that?
That's a really good question too. And so for example, something that I think is innovative and it works for them because it's a very homogeneous group, and in a small size, but there's a school adjacent to Pembina across the river in Minnesota that is a private school for a certain religious denomination, and they have like 2 staff members. They have a secretary, they have a principal, and then all of their educational resources are online. And it's all video teaching, and it works great. These kids are coming out with a great education. And I think, I'd like to say, well, it's because it's so small and everybody's the same, it works. I mean, I think that type of model can work in certain areas. And I think as a former teacher, now an administrator, it's hard to, I don't know how I could teach like that, quite frankly. I do think it's about that human connection. It's about seeing those kids every day and knowing that if they caught you on the street and needed help, you'd be there for them because they can trust you. But, I think any educator would say who's been in there long enough, if you try to see around the curve, it's never going to work. In many ways, education is kind of cyclical. We have this idea, we're going to follow it. We get close to the end and say, yeah, it didn't work. Let's start a new one. And then 10 years later, you go back to that first idea and you kind of bring it around again. Where do I see it going? I think I see it kind of staying in its same course. I think I hope that, we can kind of figure out better funding models. I think obviously if you want, just like with any job, if you want to keep high quality talent, you have to be able to pay them what they're worth. And, teachers, especially in North Dakota, we're always thrown out there as like it's a low paying job and it's this and that, whatever. And, we can't afford to pay teachers more. But I think if you want to keep good education, that's exactly what you have to do. And I think at the same time, I think teachers they always have a certain sense of adaptability. But I do think, again, in my experience, like I think sometimes the older you get in the profession, the more set in your ways you get. And that is a problem too, because you can't teach. I always say it about coaching. Like I could not coach my football players the same way I got coached. Yeah. Either they're going to quit or I'm going to get fired or sued or all of them. Like all three of those things are a possibility, and you have to be able to adapt to kids. Kids are not the same now as they were in, a previous generation, my generation before that. And so your ability to adapt, I think, to kids is what allows you to be a good educator. And that is something that I think we will see a change in, and we need to see a change in when it comes to like teacher education.
Okay. Yeah, I got two more questions for you here. What would you say you love the most about your job?
And I can't say summers off, right?
Yep.
Okay. Because that's an easy one. And that's the one I get teased about from the rest of my family. Like, how much work do you really do? I think as an educator in general, I think there is no greater joy than seeing people reach the finish line. And I used to look at it from like a disadvantaged standpoint. I firmly believe that knowledge is power and you can change your life with that. And so obviously education is a big deal to me, but it's easy to look at kids who have struggled academically and they make it at the end, or the kid who's nobody in his family's went to college before, now he's going to. Those are all things that I think really kind of brought me joy. And I think as a principal, I still feel the same way. Like you still want to see success. For me now as an administrator, my main focus besides those kids that are in the building is the staff there too. So, I think myself, my assistant principal, our superintendent, all of our support staff, like we will bend over backwards to try to make sure everything works. And I think that is one of my greatest joys in work currently when nothing happens. Like when everything is going good, then it feels like we've been doing the right thing.
Right.
When you start getting all the emails, you start getting phone calls, whatever, and it's like, okay, now we have to reevaluate what we're doing because we're not doing enough, whether that's us or whether that's the staff. But, I think that's what I find the most enjoyment in is just the million moving pieces that you're trying to align in order for everything to work.
And then, lastly, what advice would you have for students, college, high school, who would maybe want to pursue a similar path as you into maybe being a teacher or being a principal?
Well, I think, I pushed a lot. I'm not going to lie. A lot of my former students, I pushed as much as I could into education, those ones who I thought could handle it, would like it. You need... Like we should want the best. I think a lot of times in society we look at like, okay, what jobs do you think the best people that we have should have?
I think the big ones that come to mind, obviously teachers, doctors. I'm a journalism major, so I think having real strong journalists around is really important. But just like, I guess, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think, and parents always say that, you always equate money with value, right? Like lawyers, doctors, astronauts, whatever, that's the best of the best. And I would argue that in any profession, we need to fight to have the best. So those kids, like I'm pushing my best kids to be educators because we want it to grow. It's one of those few jobs that you truly interact with every single day, in your formative years, and I think, and that's not to discount other jobs, there's are plenty. I would argue in our society, every job is important, quite frankly. Imagine what we would be if we didn't have garbage men, and garbage men don't get paid enough because if they weren't there anymore, like we would be in terrible shape. So, I think your opportunity to help, as an educator, you kind of plant a seed, you plant a tree, and many times you're not around to be able to utilize that tree, right? Like when you plant a tree in your backyard, it takes 50 years for it to grow. You're not normally around in that house, alive, whatever, to reap its rewards. And I think that that's what education is. It's a selfless act. And it's hard sometimes, and again, I'm biased, but it's hard sometimes to really find another job that is as selfless as that, where you are working for somebody else so somebody else can succeed. And, as an educator, there's no greater feeling, and that's what kind of keeps you coming back every year. It's not having the summers off, because when you teach long enough, you don't really have much of a summer because you're doing other things. So that's kind of the advice that I've given, and why I really do try to steer people into education, because A, we need them. B, again, on a intrinsic level, there's nothing more rewarding to me. But when you have a teacher shortage like we have now, and we change rules and laws to make it easier to get teachers in, that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting the best candidates in. Doesn't mean you're getting the most knowledgeable people in. We're putting people in positions that they're not super comfortable with, and well, I would argue that I think on-the-job training, student teaching, things like that, you tend to learn more about teaching than you do in the classroom. There is incredible amount of value in educational psychology, in intro to teaching, what to do, what not to do, how to put yourself in a position that is advantageous and not in a spot where you can, be liable, communication, things like that. I mean, those are things that when you take a random off the street, like they're just not used to. And many times those people burn out.
Yeah.
And so, I think doing what we can to get the best in, to retain the best, to continually learn so that we can adapt as society adapts, is by far the most important thing.
No, all good points, and I couldn't agree more. That will do it for this episode of UND Grad Talk. David, thank you for joining us and giving us your time. And for our viewers, thank you again for watching, and join our next episode. So, yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.